Hello and welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Briley, your host for the next hour and a half here on Unbelievable. What a show we've got lined up for you today. My special guest is Michael Behe. He is the foremost intelligent design proponent in the world. And he is, of course, my special guest for Darwin or Design, an evening with Michael Behe on Monday, the 22nd of November. If you haven't already put it in your diary, do so now and do book in. It's essential to pre-register for this event happening at Westminster Chapel in London on Monday, the 22nd of November. Do go to premier.org.uk/unbelievable to find out more and to register yourself. It's only costs £10 and you get a free DVD as well with every booking. premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Time to get into the show, meet our guests and find out what we're talking about in terms of intelligent design and evolution today.
You're unbelievable.
Well, I've been really looking forward to today's programme. As I say, Michael Behe joins me on the show. He is Professor of Biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, author of Darwin's Black Box and more recently The Edge of Evolution. Today on the programme we're looking at intelligent design. Michael, perhaps one of the foremost proponents of intelligent design in the world. We're asking today, does modern biochemistry show that life is intelligently designed? And to help us look at that today, Keith Fox is with me in the studio, Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Southampton, also Chairman of Christians in Science. He says intelligent design is a misguided and unhelpful incursion into science. So we're going to be hearing two very different views on the programme today that aims to get you thinking every week. Well, gentlemen, thank you both for joining me on the programme today. It's a great delight to have you with me. Of course, Michael, you're coming to us by the wonders of modern technology from your hometown, but you're on a radio line, which gives us a great quality signal. Michael, before we begin, you're coming over to the UK in November. We chatted briefly about this a couple of weeks ago on the show, but tell us what is the point of this trip for you, coming over here and kind of trying to spread the word about intelligent design?
The main reason is that I think many people, not only in the United States but also in the United Kingdom, have a distorted view of intelligent design. They think of it as biblical creationism in disguise, or at least some sort of running dog for creationism. And I want to show people that, in fact, it's not that. It's a scientific idea. It's based on what we know about life, not what we don't know about life, and that the reluctance to discuss intelligent design seems more a philosophical reluctance than it does based on data.
I mean, it could be said you're almost the equivalent of a scientific heretic, Michael.
Yes.
As I said last time, even on your university webpage, you kind of have to put a disclaimer saying my views are not representative of the biology department here at Lehigh University, etc.
That's right.
I mean, let me just a little bit kind of tell you what Richard Dawkins replied to me when I invited him to discuss with you when you're over here in the UK. He said that he didn't want his name to be used as a publicity stunt for the British creationist organisation sponsoring this proposed event. And he says that one of the reasons is he never gives creationists the oxygen of publicity by sharing a platform with them. I mean, he obviously sees you and intelligent design as simply a creationist, let's say, Trojan horse. But from what you're saying, that's the whole point. You're trying to distinguish it from a religious viewpoint.
Yes. And fortunately, I get more oxygen with Professor Fox here than with Professor Dawkins. That's right. Here's an analogy for you that might work. I think intelligent design is to creationism as the Big Bang Theory is to the first book of Genesis. That is that 100 years ago, all scientists thought that the universe was eternal. But in the middle of the 20th century, data came out to show that, in fact, it seemed to be that all the matter in the universe was moving away from each other, as if in the aftermath of a giant explosion. And that gave rise to the Big Bang Theory, and that struck many people, including many scientists, as having religious implications. Maybe this was the creation event. In the beginning, God, made the heavens and the earth. But it did not arise from religious sources, from Scripture, from revelations, whatever. It was a study of nature that provoked this idea. And I think the same thing for intelligent design, that it's not does not arise from Scripture. It arises from the phenomenal complexity and elegance that has been discovered in life in particular. So it's based on evidence rather than
you want to distinguish it in that way. I mean, obviously there is, in a sense, because of, in a sense, what it points to, it has a religious connotation, and hence why we're discussing it on a Christian radio station. But I'd love to introduce at this point my other guest, Keith Fox, who joins us in the studio here in the UK. Keith, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Justin. Hello.
You too are a biochemist.
Exactly.
But you've never been persuaded by intelligent design. I mean, just before we get into the substance of today's discussion, what do you make of people who, like Dawkins, say it is just creationism by another name?
I can see why Dawkins says that. Intelligent design itself is a very, very broad spectrum. It covers everybody, really, who comes almost to the six-day creationist extreme, to those who are almost theistic evolutionists, and the design is almost indistinguishable. So I sympathise where he's coming from, but I do agree with Michael. There is a difference between strict creationism and intelligent design. I think probably to most scientists they're both equally an anathema. They don't go with orthodox scientific understanding, but yet I'd certainly agree with Michael. There's a difference between them.
I mean, perhaps something that's important to point out here is that despite what Dawkins has said there, Michael, I don't think you would term yourself a creationist, would you?
No, I call myself a biochemist. And part of my job is to try to explain the systems that have been discovered in the cell, or at least that's part of biochemistry job.
And you do agree with essentially a great deal of, modern science is finding. You believe in common descent.
That's correct. It's very important to realize that intelligent design is not the opposite of evolution. It's more or less the opposite of Darwinism. And Darwinism, evolution had been proposed before Darwin, but Darwin's claim to fame was that he thought he found essentially an unguided, unplanned mechanism which could mimic design. And intelligent design says no, that his mechanism does not mimic the design features of life, but it does not say that life could not have arisen a long time ago in the past and descended through common descent to the present.
Can I draw you out on that? In that I'm agreeing with some of the things you're saying about the difference between intelligent design, creationism, and linking that in with Scripture, but it's finding some of the things that we agree on. So at the start, it might be worth making it clear that we agree that the universe is very old, and that we agree in common descent. In other words, that we and chimpanzees and many other species have a common ancestor. Are we agreed on that as we begin this conversation?
Sure. Yes, we are.
Right. I'm pleased about that. I thought that's what we'd agree on, but there'll be many within the intelligent design movement who wouldn't agree with us on that.
That's right. And intelligent design is not. I think the evidence for common descent is very, very good. But it's a separate question than whether something was designed or not. The question of how something was designed is separate from whether or not we can detect that something was designed.
Well, intelligent design in that sense is a broad church, but it'll be interesting to see. I'm looking forward to a variety of people coming to listen to you, Michael, on Monday the 22nd of November for this event at Westminster Chapel in London. Let me remind you, if you're listening and you want to get along to that, it's taking place, as I say, Westminster Chapel in the evening of of Monday, the 22nd of November. You can book in, register yourself. That is essential, by the way, to register for that event. You can't get in on the night on the door. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. That's the show page, or indeed /Behe for the events page, but you can get to it either way. So premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Now, let's talk about intelligent design, because I've had a barrage of emails. I don't normally get so many emails in advance of a show as I've had for this one. But obviously, when people found out you were coming on, Michael, they sort of, wanted to get their voice heard. Let me, for instance, read this one from Mark, who says, Michael Behe's ideas have been proven wrong, in capital letters. Not a little bit right, 100% wrong. There is no science in his proposal. It is not a theory. It's even been proven wrong in multiple tests by Christian scientists. He's not deluded. He's a liar. He's been told he was wrong and only keeps his job because he can't be sacked under tenure. Lying is bad enough, but lying for God is surely even worse. Okay, so lots of accusations, Michael. What do you say?
Well, I think he should take a deep breath and maybe have a little wine or something, calm down, and we could talk about this. Opinions run very, very strong on this. And it's, you can find people who say that I was proven wrong, the day that my first book came out, Darwin's Black Box. And then you'll say, no, other people will say, no, here's a paper that was published in the year 2001. That proves you wrong. And the proof is in the eye of the beholder. Many people have brought forth arguments against some of the points I have made, and I almost always find that they're arguing at cross purposes with me. They are not addressing the issues I'm addressing. They're making assumptions that I don't make, and so I sincerely disagree with the emailer that I've been proven wrong.
I have to say, though, in some instances, I've seen enough of the articles on, say, the evolution of the bacterial flagellum that I was surprised that the ID people are still pursuing that one. And just exactly what sort of evidence eventually will say, okay, on that one I was mistaken.
Let's go to the bacterial flagellum. And just for those who aren't completely au fait with the intelligent design arguments, and particularly that some of the key arguments you put forward over 10 years ago in Darwin's Black Box, Michael, this, because in a way it's such a physical and kind of visual example, I think it's really caught on in the public's imagination. But there is this so-called bacterial flagellum that exists as one of the tiny microscopic organisms in each human cell. It is effectively, I think, a sort of outboard motor for a bacterium.
Exactly.
And you made the case in Darwin's Black Box that this was irreducibly complex. That is to say, the way it's constituted could not have arisen by a kind of gradualistic Darwinian process of evolution. All the parts had to be there at the same time in order for it to do the job it's supposed to do, in much the same way as a mousetrap has to have all its parts in order for it to be able to do the job it's supposed to do. 14 years on from stating that, you say no one's proven me wrong on that.
That's right. And as a matter of fact, it's become more complex than we knew in 1996. So that, in fact, I would argue that the situation has become more grim for Darwinism than it was back in those days.
What do you say to that, Keith?
I'd contradict that. I think we know a lot more about the bacterial flagellum. We know certainly a lot about the genomics of the organisms than the genes that code for those things now. And we can see some of the similarities with other components in a cell. I mean, I have two papers in front of me, one of which is entitled Stepwise Formation of the Bacterial Flagellum System, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, published 2007. Another one, From the Origin of the Species to the Origin of the Bacterial Flagellum, Nature Reviews in Microbiology. I'm sure you're aware of those. And they both draw out some of the steps that those components of the bacterial flagellum, where they could have come from.
So they give a possible pathway.
Yes.
Here's the problem with those papers. Yes, I've read both of them, and to tell you the truth, I'd like to sit down and have a beer with you and show you exactly why they don't address the problem whatsoever. Those studies were studies in what's called protein sequence analysis.
Correct.
That is, you can ask if a protein, which is a polymer, a kind of a beads on a string conjunction of things called amino acids. And proteins from one species are oftentimes similar to proteins from another. And we can infer that those two proteins came from a common ancestor. But again, remember, intelligent design does not object to common ancestry. All these studies did, and as a matter of fact, I think the PNAS study that you cited is not accepted even by other Darwinists who are not friendly to ID at all. All it did was show that there's similarities between different proteins in different organisms and the proteins of the bacterial flagellum. Well, okay, so there's similarities between them, but they were doing other things. They were not together. In order to build, suppose you had a parts shop somewhere, and you wanted to build an outboard motor. Okay, and there were screws around because there were screws on bicycles. And there was a propeller around because there was a propeller on a fan over here. You have to take all of those parts and you have to get them together in the right way, step by tiny step, in order to build yourself the outboard motor. Now in the cell, that's done automatically. There's no conscious agent in the cell. So the information for putting that together had to arise somewhere. And
correct.
Just comparing the sequences, I'm sorry, just let me finish this.
Sorry.
Just comparing the sequences doesn't tell you how that gets done.
But we do know that things within the cell self-assemble, so that the proteins interact with each other and form complexities. And if those components are there, maybe doing other jobs, which is what the evolutionary view of the bacterial flagellum is, that those proteins that make up that rather complex structure had other functions at the time that come together within the context of the cell to make a very complex thing, the bacterial flagellum. In the same way, the argument about the mousetrap, it's a very convincing one, except when you think, well, I take it apart, I could use part of it as a doorstop or a tie clip or a notepad. But in the right context, they come together into something that has a different function.
Well, no, I don't think so. I'm sitting in a room and I see a doorstop over on the ground here, and it's this kind of large piece of metal. And I have toothpicks at home, and I have other things that people have suggested would be swell parts to make a mousetrap with. But if I took all those parts, you wouldn't be able to make a mousetrap with those parts. They are, in fact, a protein or a piece of something else doing another job makes it harder for that piece to be fit into another system, another complex system, because it's originally shaped for the job it's doing, and it has to be adjusted at the very least to its new job. So there's nothing about a toothpick or a doorstop that makes you want to say, oh, this is a fine precursor to a mousetrap. And there is nothing about those proteins talked about in that article in PNAS that gives you any indication they would be able to form a complex flagellum.
But we're not talking about those proteins losing their original function. There can be gene duplications, in which case you have gain of function as the new complexity arises. And if it's a new function, that new function doesn't have to be functioning at 100% activity to start with. It can be something that has a very low activity, 1%, but it still works. It's a bit like the way in which I do DIY back in the home. I'm hopeless at it. I find a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the other and a tool that fits the job. And if I was a professional, I'd use totally different tools. But I make do, and that's what biology does all the time.
Well, I think you're speculating here. You're an intelligent agent, and so when you go home and work around the house, you might make do with whatever and look to see what you should put together. But as we know, evolution, Darwinian evolution, is supposed to be utterly blind, totally blind. And taking something that was doing something else and even duplicating it, it still fit just for its other job.
Is there a problem, though, Michael, that, a lot of people at this point will say, well, what about your explanation then, design? It's just as susceptible to, I could just as easily say that you're, assuming a lot there, in the sense that it doesn't actually explain anything to say it's designed. All it does is say there's a mystery here, and I'm going to say that it was, design or perhaps even God that did it. And as we do come closer to discovering the pathways that evolution could have taken, then your God, your designer, gets smaller and smaller as the gaps get smaller and smaller. I mean, that's a classic objection. What do you say to it?
Well, I would again use the Big Bang as an analogy. When the Big Bang was first proposed, there were a number of scientists who opposed it simply because it seemed to point to God. What could cause a universe to come into existence except something outside a universe? And there were it's easy to find quotes of some scientists who were strongly opposed to it. And what if a physicist back then says, we're not going to, we should stay away from this Big Bang theory because it has theistic implications, some people think. We're just going to wait around until we think of a better theory to explain this apparent motion. And that doesn't have these unwelcome philosophical implications.
I'm not sure
if that had happened. If that had happened, then science would have lost a lot of progress.
Because I'm not sure that's a useful analogy, because the Big Bang is based on a theory of what did happen, whereas I think intelligent design is based on what we don't know happened. It's a gap in our knowledge, and actually saying we can't know. What I'm fascinated about is supposing we ever could know with absolute certainty the way that, say, the bacterial flagellum evolved, and I could present you with an atomistic pathway, one step by another. Where does that leave your designer? At what point would you put your hand up and say, okay, there is a pathway?
Well, if there is one, I mean, suppose somebody did an experiment and they showed that some complex system that I would have claimed were irreducibly complex after a long, long time and after selection pressure and, say, a lot of bacteria in a laboratory and so on. If that happened, then I would be wrong. But it's happened before in science that people have been wrong. Intelligent design is falsifiable. What happens, though, if you say, or somebody says, that the bacterial flagellum evolved by Darwinian means, and somebody goes in a laboratory to test that, and they knock out the genes for the bacterial flagellum in some species that had them, and they grow it under some selective pressure for motion, and they grow it for a long time, 50,000 generations or so, and at the end of it, nothing happened, or nothing much happened. It deleted a couple of genes, but there's nothing new, nothing complex. Would you say then that Darwinian evolution had been falsified? And if not, then what are your criteria for falsifying Darwinian evolution?
We can't go back in time to know what those evolutionary pressures are that caused the bacterial flagellum or its originator.
We can do experiments.
We can do experiments based on what we hypothesize might be those conditions. We're talking about things that have evolved over tens, hundreds of millions of years. So we can't do an experiment over that sort of timescale.
But is there a problem here then, Keith, that while you say, ID doesn't give us any explanation, the problem is that the evolution kind of, if we're assuming it from the outset, then we kind of, everything will automatically fall under its umbrella, and you kind of, it's the one thing you don't question in science, and I think that's where a lot of people feel, well, surely we need to have a skeptical attitude to evolution itself, not just assume that the things that we don't understand will automatically fall under its umbrella.
I think most scientists are eminently skeptical. They're wanting to know more. They ask the question, how, why? The scientist isn't satisfied with the answer that says, I just don't know.
But they wouldn't go outside evolution, having said that, would they? Realistically?
They probably wouldn't, but it is within the context of evolution. Can we put together a realistic scenario that's not just a just-so story, that in molecular terms does explain how this could have happened? And as we look over sort of the last 10 or 15 years, the bits of evidence that come, we still don't have anything like a complete picture of the way that it assembled. But all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle that we have in place are still consistent with an evolutionary hypothesis.
Well, let me tell you about an evolutionary laboratory experiment that's been going on in the United States. I imagine you've heard of it, Professor Fox, but imagine the listeners haven't. This is the biggest laboratory evolution experiment that has ever been done. It was started about 20 or so years ago by a man named Professor Richard Lenski at Michigan State University. And he started to grow the bacterium called E. coli in his laboratory every day. And every day he would take a little bit of the culture that he grew and transfer it to a fresh flask and grow it again. And it would grow at about 6 to 7 generations per day. And he was interested in seeing how it would evolve. And over the course of the 20 years, because its reproduction rate is so fast, it has undergone 50,000 generations, which is equivalent to about 1 million years or more in large animal generations. Also, he was able to generate enormous numbers of organisms because bacteria are so small, so that there have been trillions of organisms in his experiments. And he found that, in fact, they did evolve by Darwinian means and that they did improve and they grew faster and they did better in the medium in which they were grown. But when he looked to see for the mutations that caused them to improve, he found that, in fact, they got rid of genes. They deleted genes. They turned things off. The best mutation he found was in a strain in which the gene for making the sugar ribose was just thrown away. It was deleted so that it could not work anymore. He found nothing that seemed to be on its way to a complex system. So the best evidence we have of what Darwinian evolution does is that it improves organisms by breaking pre-existing systems.
We are going to have to take a quick break here, and I will allow you to come back to this, Keith, because this is important and kind of gets to the heart in many ways of your most recent book, Michael, The Edge of Evolution. So we're asking the kinds of questions you've been hearing today, such as was life intelligently designed, or can evolution in that sense be falsified? Is there such a thing as can random mutation, which is obviously the engine house of evolution in some ways, can that actually produce complexity? Michael says, as far as the evidence shows, all it ever does is actually reduce the level of complexity in a cell. Now, I'm sure Keith will want to respond. I'm sure you may want to respond. If you do want to get in touch, then I encourage you to email into the show. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. And you can also send me, you can phone in and leave me a voicemail message, 08456 52 52 52, and select option 8. Don't forget that Michael is my special guest for an evening we're calling Darwin or Design, ? An evening with Michael Behe. That's taking place at Westminster Chapel on Monday, the 22nd of November in the evening. You can find out more about that and book in for it. You do have to book in for that if you want to attend. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable, which is, of course, the webpage of this programme. I hope you can join us there, and we're going to have a good amount of time for question and answer, because I'm sure there have been many people like Keith who disagree strongly with Michael about this subject, who will want to pose some of the difficult questions about intelligent design. Again, log on to premier.org.uk/unbelievable, click through to the link for the bookings page, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you there. We're going to be back in a short moment's time. We're going to continue to look at whether modern biochemistry shows that life is intelligently designed or not, with my special guest today, Michael Behe, Professor of Biochemistry over at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, author of Darwin's Black Box, and Keith Fox, who's a Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Southampton and Chairman himself of Christians in Science. You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio. Welcome back to the programme that gets Christians and non-Christians thinking, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with the show today. Really controversial subject we're looking at, and it always raises temperatures in the scientific world, at least. We're talking about intelligent design. My special guest on the show today, Michael Behe, probably one of the foremost proponents of intelligent design in the world. It was his book, Darwin's Black Box, that 14 years ago really launched, you could say, the intelligent design movement in its modern form. His latest book is The Edge of Evolution. We're going to be looking at some of the arguments he puts in there in the course of the rest of the programme. He says that as far as he can see, the latest information on science and biology shows that Darwinian evolution is, in some sense, just can't explain the complexity of life if we're relying on random mutation, on the purposeless blind forces of evolution. We'll hear what Keith Fox has to say in response to that. He's Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Southampton, Chairman of Christians in Science. He disagrees strongly with intelligent design. And let me repeat again, if you want to hear from Michael Behe in person and be able to ask the questions of him yourself, then why not come along to the event we're hosting at Westminster Chapel in London on Monday the 22nd of November. And you can find out details on the webpage premier.org.uk/unbelievable, or phone in and book your ticket at that's 08456 52 52 52, and someone on the phone there will be happy to help you. So we ran out of time, and I'm sure you were wanting to respond to what Michael had to say there at the end of that last section, Keith. He was essentially saying, all that we've seen in the laboratory in terms of any evidence for evolution is that organisms actually decrease in complexity. They jettison pieces of their DNA, how on earth can you say that complexity arises when we just don't see it in the laboratory?
Within the context of that elegant experiment that was done over many years, that is correct. But that's an E. coli. That's one particular bacterial species growing all by itself in laboratory conditions, where they were starved of glucose at various times, I think, to see how they respond to that. But that's very different from an E. coli that normally lives within your gut and mine, in competition with other microorganisms, in a totally different environment, all sorts of other different selection pressures.
Michael?
Well, that's a rationalization in my view. This is the best and most extensive laboratory data we have, and what's more, it fits pretty well with what we see in nature too. There's a paper that just came out in Trends in Genetics a week or so ago called A Golden Age for Evolutionary Genetics, about genomic studies of adaptation in natural populations. And in the abstract, he says we've been able to study now the genetics of evolution in the wild. But the problem is that essentially the evolution they study are loss of traits. And he ends his abstract by saying, nonetheless, most studies of recent evolution involve the loss of traits, and we still understand little of the genetic changes needed in the origin of novel traits. So Lenski's experiment, in which he saw the loss of genes and the loss of traits in his bacteria in the laboratory, is exactly what naturalists see when they look in the wild.
Let me pick up on you on that, because at what stage are you prepared to accept that a new trait could come on? I mean, you're a biochemist, you said you accept common descent. That is saying that over time there have been new function. Has every new function then been the cause of your designer?
Not every new function, but I would guess every new complex function that required the interaction of several different parts.
So this is the key.
So one example that is cited of a new function evolving reasonably recently is the production of an enzyme that degrades nylon, a man-made fibre. There were organisms that were exposed to actually the effluent from a nylon factory, evolved the ability to degrade that. It's something that's not out there in nature. It's a new function.
Well, no, that's it's been reported as that, but that's not quite correct. It doesn't degrade nylon. It degrades a precursor, a small organic chemical that's used in the synthesis of nylon.
That's correct, but it's still something that isn't out there in nature, and it is a new function.
Well, that may be true, but the question is how hard is it to do that? And I suspect it's not so hard. Hydrolyzing some amide bond or an ester or something like that is not quite the same thing as being an outboard motor. So,
but this is a function that's evolved over just a few decades. We're talking in terms of evolution of millions of years.
Let me emphasize that intelligent design doesn't say that Darwinism can't explain anything. There are many things it's a good explanation for, antibiotic resistance, pesticide resistance, the malaria resistance in humans, and so on. We say that it can't explain everything, particularly the complex systems that I discuss in my books.
I mean, one of the...
Is a scientist actually allowed to ask the question to explain it? Or have you said there's a point at which we can't go? That scientists are always asking questions as to where did that come from? Where did that arise? How does that work?
Sure.
And ID seems to me it's a science stopper. It says that I don't know, and I never will know.
No, that's not... Well, again, let me point to the Big Bang. In the same way, the Big Bang could have been thought of as a science stopper. How could we investigate what caused a universe to come into existence? What existed before the Big Bang? So that was a stopper too. It's not that all explanations in science are science stoppers, in the sense that they purport to explain how something happened. If somebody has a different idea how it happened, then he's just going to have to go out and gather evidence for his idea. But all explanations in science intend to explain a situation, and in that sense to remove it from
that's very
the
different.
Need for further study.
That's very different from saying I can't explain it and we won't explain it, and so we shouldn't go there, almost.
Did I ever say that?
No, you didn't say shouldn't
I
go there.
can't explain or won't explain it?
Well, you're saying that there isn't an explanation other than the designer for, say, how the flagellum arose, whereas the scientist says, I want to understand the process by which that happened.
Well, what if there wasn't a process by which that happened? Then the scientist who says that is asking a poorly formed question. It's like asking, I want to study how the sun shines by gravitational contraction energy, which was the main mechanism thought for the sun to shine in the 19th century. But that didn't pan out because the sun does not shine that way.
But this is fits in with the total sort of biochemical paradigm, where the biochemist asks questions. What's the relationship between this protein and that protein, or what's the relationship between the genes that code from those? How could they have some form of common ancestor that you've agreed that we have common descent? And the biochemist says, how does this all fit together on a molecular biochemical basis? And to say that there's an intelligent designer who did that actually says that we're wasting our time asking the question. And I wonder where we would be as a scientific society if we'd done that further down the line.
Well, Professor Fox, let me ask you a question, because some theistic evolutionists think that our universe was purposely fine-tuned and set up as to allow life to occur. Do you subscribe to that view or not?
I find that a very convincing view. I wouldn't necessarily rest everything on that, but I do find that quite a convincing view in terms of the fundamental constants of the universe, that they are very, very finely tuned.
If you read my book, The Edge of Evolution, through to the end, I actually say you can explain by fine-tuning. You can just say the universe was much, much more fine-tuned than you have agreed that it is. That it was fine-tuned not only in its laws, not only in the amount of matter it has, not only in the charge on the electron and physical things, but it was fine-tuned so that certain events would happen in it.
Except
so that from the beginning, the universe was set up to unfold as we see it. It was not an accident.
Except that physical fine-tuning is based entirely on what we know, that we know those numbers, we know a lot about them, we know how little they can vary.
We've inferred the design from what we know, and you're saying that Michael is inferring design from what he doesn't know.
We don't know exactly, yes.
Well, I would say that's incorrect, because we infer design from what we do know. When the structure of the bacterial flagellum was not known, nobody was inferring that it was designed. Back in Darwin's day, the cell was thought to be something simple, a little piece of protoplasm, like a kind of a piece of jelly. And it's only because of what science has grown to know of the complexity of the cell that the design hypothesis comes up.
Can I just move things on a bit here, gentlemen? I would like to, read a portion of a letter that someone sent in. This is Gavin, who says he's a Christian himself, but he doesn't agree with intelligent design. He says of intelligent design, it does have an interesting idea at its core, and it does challenge some aspects of biological evolution. But these have been sufficiently answered from a scientific standpoint, so agreeing again with Mark, our other emailer. And the controversy is only kept alive within non-scientific circles, who are typically predisposed to reject evolution and looking for any attractive means to do that. Well, we've perhaps covered a bit of that as to whether there is a sort of religious element to it. But he goes on to say here, Behe is a controversial figure, yes, but he's not a controversial scientist by any stretch, nor conducting intelligent design research in a lab. If he were to successfully do so, it would revolutionise modern biology. I mean, and a lot of people have said this. If you could somehow, do an experiment to show intelligent design was the case, science would fall over itself to hear your papers and to publish them, Michael. But it's not. You don't have any kind of... it is a kind of gap. There's a mystery there, and it's a kind of, and as Keith says, a lot of people just see that as non-science. It's a science stopper, they say.
Well, you might not be surprised to find that I disagree.
You don't say.
The question is, how do we decide that something was designed if we don't do it ourselves? We decide something is designed if we see what I call a purposeful arrangement of parts. That is, parts that are fit together and they do something, like, say the mousetrap. Whenever we see that, then we conclude there has been design. And before Darwin, everybody in the world agreed that biology was the product of design. And as a matter of fact, everybody now agrees that things in biology overwhelmingly look designed. I can quote Richard Dawkins himself saying that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. He wrote that in his classic book, The Blind Watchmaker. We're in the situation now where we have evidence of design in the purposeful arrangement of parts, and all we have is promissory notes from Darwinists and other folks that no, we can explain it some other way. But in my completely unbiased opinion, they do not have the experimental or other evidence to support their claim.
It's part of human nature, though, isn't it, to see design sometimes where it isn't there. We see purpose where it is accident. We see it where things have just come together in a certain way. And to some extent what you're saying is actually an argument, I think, from incredulity, which to the person who's a non-scientist is eminently believable, that it just seems too complex. But we know that science is like that. You only look at the physics, that the physics of the Big Bang, the physics of black holes, is something that blows my mind out. But that doesn't say it's not right. Well, so same with the biology of the evolution of complex species. There are mechanisms that we can propose for how that may have happened. It does seem very complicated.
The question is, I suppose, though, Keith, why isn't it allowed in this branch, this particular? I mean, in every other branch, if you like, of history, science, other areas of science, we would say design. We can say if it looks like this, then if we find these particular scratchings on a cave, in such a manner, we don't assume that they just appeared there randomly. We do say, yes, this is evidence of design. So why in this case is design not allowed, I suppose? You say, yes, it kind of leaves it kind of open and mysterious, and where do we go from here? But maybe that just is the way it is, and if it's designed, then it's designed.
Because we have explanations for it. If we had no explanation at all, then Michael would be right. There would be a very good evidence for design. But we do have explanations that fit in with the rest of the way in which we do science.
But you're saying, Michael, these explanations are simply too patchy. They don't actually overwhelm the design argument.
I know of no branch of science that has such loose standards of evidence as Darwinism does. People see things that are vaguely similar, and they can believe that fantastic things have happened. So I think it's actually. Dr. Fox says mine was an argument from incredulity, but I thought scientists were supposed to be skeptical. On the other hand, I think many Darwinists have the opposite fault. That is, they have arguments from credulity. They say, "Look at this! Don't you believe that this could have happened?" And
But
I don't think that's the way science should proceed.
It's the job of the scientists to propose hypotheses and then do experiments to test those hypotheses. ID doesn't have a hypothesis that I can test. If you put a mechanism together that says this is how a flagellum could have arisen, you can do experiments to say, is this consistent with the way we see this in other organisms? And beware, of course, that there's not just one flagellum. There are many different species with different kinds of flagella.
Yes,
we can ask all those questions of it.
But as I said earlier in the program, you can test design, you can falsify design. I say that complex systems cannot come together by random without intelligent input, without intelligent guidance. So all somebody would have to do to prove me wrong is to go into the laboratory and grow those bacteria like Lenski did. And show that some complex system could arise.
We've heard why Keith disagrees with you on that front, but I think it would be interesting as we proceed now to maybe turn to, if you like, some of the numbers that come into this, and you particularly delve into this in your latest book, The Edge of Evolution, Michael, where you talk about the mathematics of what it would take to get some of these genetic variations going and that sort of thing. But before we do that, I'd like to just, again, let you know, if you're listening and you'd like to interact with what we're talking about today, you can get in touch by email, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Why not also join up with the Premier community? You can find it by visiting the Unbelievable show page at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Click through to the Premier community. It'll take you to the page of this show, and lots of people engaging in discussions every day there on issues of faith, science, atheism, the Bible, and all kinds of other issues. So encourage you to go there. That's also the address, by the way, if you want to register for this event that we're putting on where Michael will be speaking. You can come along, ask those questions that we've been asking today of him. That's Darwin or Design, an evening with Michael Behe. I'll be hosting that event at Westminster Chapel in London. Doors are 6:30 for a 7 o'clock start. Do hope I can see you there, and you've got to register in advance for that particular event. So I encourage you now to do it. If you're thinking of it and you haven't done it yet, then go along to the webpage premier.org.uk/unbelievable to register for that event on Monday the 22nd of November. And there's even a DVD, I understand, that anyone who registers will receive. So find out more about that when you go to that page. Okay, gentlemen, let's get back into the discussion as we continue looking at the whole question of intelligent design and whether it is a credible challenge to Darwinian evolution.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Just as we come towards the end of this section of the programme, Michael, one of the things you draw out in this book, The Edge of Evolution, is that there is, if you like, a mathematical odds involved when it comes to whether genes will develop in certain ways, will mutate in certain ways, and to give beneficial side effects. You sort of liken it to the odds that are involved with winning the lottery. These are big numbers that you're talking about. Can you just give us a brief overview, and then we'll have Keith respond to what your problem is on a mathematical level with the likelihood of complexity arising simply through this process of random mutation of genes?
Yeah, I think I can. One good example is the sickle cell gene. Most people have heard of that. It helps confer malaria resistance on some people who have it and live in malaria-ridden countries. Now, it comes about because one nucleotide, or one of the components of the 3 billion components of DNA, has changed from one thing to another, and because of how faithful DNA is replicated, that change can happen just 1 in every 100 million times that the DNA is replicated. So that sickle cell gene will arise fresh, not inherited from a parent, but freshly from a new mutation in 1 in 100 million people. Okay, that's fine, but that's only one change. In my books, I emphasize that many structures in the cell seem to require many changes before they would be active. So if you needed 2 changes to get some feature, and suppose that one of the changes did not help or was downright unhelpful downright dangerous by itself, then you would need 1 in 100 million squared, which is 1 in 10 to the 16th. And that's a real big number. And you go to the third one or the fourth one, if you need several in a row, you quickly get out of what is biologically feasible.
In the way that matching 6 lottery numbers instead of just 2 is that much more difficult.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're talking about big numbers.
It's easy to draw, if think of a number from 1 to 50. Okay, it's easy. You have a 2% chance of matching 1. Well, okay. How about match 2 numbers of 1 to 50? Uh-oh. Now it's 1 in 50 squared.
So these are big numbers we're talking about. It's very small probabilities that these things are going to arise in the time scale we're talking about and in the massive population we're talking about. But Keith, what do you want to say to this?
Yeah, I think this suffers from something we call the fallacy of large numbers, and many mathematicians have dealt with this. What you're looking at is the likelihood of one particular mutation occurring in one particular place. The likelihood of a mutation occurring at all is much greater than that. It's the same as if I roll 6 dice. The chance of getting 6 sixes if I roll them all together is phenomenally small. But if I roll them one at a time and then wait for before I get a 6 on the first dice, before I roll the second one, the chances of getting 6 sixes are much reduced. The chance of getting any particular deck of cards is very low. But every one is unique, and you'll get a deck of cards. You will get a deck of cards. You'll get a deck of cards. So I don't think the maths hold up, and far better mathematicians have critiqued that edge of evolution, the probabilities you put there.
Well, I disagree because nature, we have evidence from nature. How frequently has the sickle mutation arisen? And how often have other genetic mutations occurred which give resistance to malaria? The sickle cell mutation has arisen approximately once in every 10 to the 8th people who were born, in 10 to the 8th people who were born. Other mutations occur more frequently, but the sickle mutation is perhaps the best mutation you can have if you're going to live in a malarious country.
But evolution is not directional, so you can't determine there necessarily will be a means that will, by changing an amino acid in hemoglobin, that we will be able to get further resistance to malaria. These things just happen and are selected, so you can't use it to predict one way or the other.
Well, if you can't use it to predict, why are you confident that that in fact undirected mutations can do what Darwinists claim for them?
Because evolution looks back, not forwards.
Yeah, but it as I said before, we have no evidence that it can produce these complex structures. We look back
you keep saying
and we
that,
see complex
You
structures.
keep saying that, but
we
plenty
don't
of the
see the
scientific
mechanism
papers
for
show
it.
there is evidence. At what point do you appear to say that is a difference between I can't believe that or I won't believe that? There are papers there, and you consistently say, I find that incredible. I want more evidence. At what point do we stop asking for more evidence and say, okay, there's a good story there?
The papers that you point out concern common descent. They do not concern the mechanism of evolution. And intelligent design is concerned exclusively with that mechanism. Can, a number of different parts be arranged accidentally or randomly and into a lucky configuration and then spread in the population? Or beyond some point, does it take an arranger, a designer, someone to make sure that the parts get together?
What is common descent except the summation of lots of small evolutionary steps? Now you say you accept common descent, but what's behind that? Are you actually denying the evolution behind it?
No, I'm not sure what your question is.
What I think you're denying, Michael, is that random mutation accounts for it.
That's right. One can have directed mutations.
And directed mutations in that sense, which are essentially designed in that sense. I mean, what strikes me as interesting here, Keith, is that you are a theistic evolutionist. Now, I don't know how, you might parse that in terms of what's going on with evolution and where God fits into that. But in a sense, you believe in evolution, in the Darwinian account of evolution, but you believe God in some way set that in motion, let's say, that was intended, purposed. Now, do you as a Christian believe that God intended for, let's say, yes, random mutations to happen and produce humans, incredibly complex humans, but in that sense, they weren't random. God intended them to take their pathways they took eventually. Could have taken a different pathway, but actually God intended humans to be the end result. It was directed in that sense.
Only in the end it might have been directed, in that I don't think there's anything special about our anatomy, our physiology, our biochemistry, actually, but in a way in which God has set the laws of the world up, of the universe, is that ultimately conscious people, conscious beings would arise through an evolutionary process. They may not have 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes. They could be totally different shapes, but they would still be beings made in the image of God to relate to Him. That's, I think, what
I suppose, yes, the evolution of consciousness is a significant part of that. We're going to come back to this, gents, because we've run out of time in this section of the programme, and we're going to have a wrapping up. And I think we need to get to some of the theological implications of design as well. I think this is important, and where we often will end up when we're talking about it in the context of faith and Christianity. So if you're listening and, as I say, you'd like to get involved, again, the email address is unbelievable@premier.org.uk. What do you make of the arguments of intelligent design, specifically of Michael Behe? Have you read Darwin's Black Box? Be interested in your thoughts. And don't forget, of course, to log on and register if you are interested in coming along to this evening with Michael Behe when he's over here. He's touring the country in November on the speaking dates, and the one in London is on Monday the 22nd of November. You can join me, Justin Briley, the host of that particular evening at Westminster Chapel. That's Monday the 22nd of November. Find out more at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Click on the link there to book in for the event. Back in just a moment's time to finish up our programme today. Welcome back to Unbelievable, the programme that gets you thinking every Saturday afternoon. We have a lot of listeners, both on our medium wave and DAB service, also who listen to the podcast, though. And if you're listening by podcast, great to have you with me. And let me tell you what's coming up on the show next week. We're going to be looking at the apologetics of C.S. Lewis. We're going to be hearing from one of the key C.S. Lewis experts in the world, Michael Ward, next week. He's with me in the studio. He'll be in debate with atheist Dan Barker, who's out in the States. Dan was a Christian. Is now an atheist, and he says he reread Lewis as an atheist and didn't find him nearly as convincing the second time round. We'll find out why Michael believes that C.S. Lewis and the arguments he has for God are still compelling 60 years on from the time he wrote them. So that's next week, C.S. Lewis and his apologetics. If you can tune in, that's great. And don't forget, I mentioned it a lot, but hey, this is the show to mention it, isn't it? We've got this event coming up on Monday the 22nd of November with Michael Behe. He's my guest on today's programme alongside Keith Fox. And if you'd like to register for that event, trying to keep the cost as low as possible, just £10 to register to come along to that evening. You can do so by visiting the webpage premier.org.uk/unbelievable, and I'll be hosting that event. If you're not sort of someone who's familiar with kind of booking things over the internet, why don't you pick up the phone and call Premier Response on 08456 52 52 52, and they'll be able to help you as well. But you'll have to do that on a weekday. They don't tend to be able to do that kind of thing at the weekend when this show broadcasts. So hold on to that for Monday. In the meantime, let's crack on with the show. We're talking about intelligent design, asking, does biochemistry show that life was intelligently designed? Here on the show that gets you thinking.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
It was about 14 years ago that Michael Behe published Darwin's Black Box and really set the ball rolling as far as the modern intelligent design movement. He's been talking about that on the show today. He is a Christian, but this is not a kind of Christian atheist issue per se. Indeed, the person sitting opposite me in the show today is Keith Fox, chairman of Christians in Science, but very opposed to the whole concept of intelligent design, feels it's a misguided sort of area of science, if you would call it science at all. Keith, it's not just the scientific aspects of intelligent design that you take issue with. You actually object to it as well on a theological level. Tell us why that is.
That's correct. I mean, as a Christian, I understand that God is responsible for everything, for the whole universe, upholding the entire universe by his power, moment by moment. Not just isolated incidents. And intelligent design reduces God to some form of semi-deist, if you like, who comes in and tinkers with something every now and then because it's not good enough. I want to ask the questions about what does that say about God, who maybe is then designing some things that are not beneficial. The bacterial flagellum gives the bacterium greater motility. In some instances, that make it more pathogenic. What does that say about the kind of God we're believing in?
Yeah, I mean, these are the questions, and I suppose it's an aesthetic question in a way, a theological question about what does it say of God if God is somehow intervening in this molecular level almost of life.
And allied to that is the question, if we have a designer who's coming in tinkering with it, how is he doing it? Is that by miraculous means, or is it actually by a purely scientific, rational means, where if we saw the thing happening, we say, oh yes, it's that reacting with that, and it makes sense. In which case there is, it's just pure biochemistry anyway.
Yeah, and it's kind of a semantic difference in a way. Michael, do you have a problem with the theology of intelligent design?
Well, it depends on which theology you're talking about. I disagree with Professor Fox that intelligent design requires tinkering, quote unquote, which many people think and which is mistaken. And as I've written in my newer book, The Edge of Evolution, everything that I think was designed could have been implied or incipient in the universe from the moment of its creation, from the Big Bang or whatever. And the fine-tuning that I'm suggested that extends deeper than the fine-tuning that Professor Fox agrees with is not a difference in kind from what he's proposing. It's just a difference in degree. We both agree that God made a universe with specific properties. I'm just arguing that as science has discovered more and more, it seems that God has made a much more specific universe with much more finely tuned properties than we had guessed before. So I don't see that intelligent design gives us any more.
What you're talking about is a directed process in that sense, and that would suggest a God who directed, as Keith said, pathogenic things. So the kind of disease and everything else. Yes. That was intelligently designed as well in that sense, and that doesn't sit well, does it, with the idea of
well,
God?
You can answer this in two ways. You can answer it as a scientist. And as a scientist, it's not my job to say I'm not going to conclude that the flagellum was designed because it hurt some people, and therefore some people might blame God. It's my job as a scientist to describe nature as I see it, investigate nature as I see it, and let the chips fall where they may. And you can answer it in a theological way also, and say that, well, maybe the bacteria that have flagella and malaria and so on that cause people some pain, maybe they're also doing other things which are overall good for life and even good for human life somewhere.
I mean, it's interesting to me that it could be accused of you, Keith, that you actually have more of a theological basis for holding to your scientific view of events than Michael does. You like evolution from the point of view that that by its very nature, it kind of means God doesn't have to be kind of invoked as the God who created the bad bits as well as the good bits, and so you have a theological conviction about it yourself.
In a sense, that's correct. But theology and science, the whole religion, faith thing, has to tie together. It's not something where it's in two different compartments. Either it makes a coherent sense together, or it falls apart. And I think that the theistic evolution does actually make sense theologically, and it's acceptable scientifically in terms of what we know. I mean, intelligent design, I want to ask, what didn't God design? What of those things that we're saying aren't intelligent design, that we say arose by natural random processes? Where was God in that?
Yeah, and if those can arise, and yet we still believe in a God who is sovereign, why shouldn't the other things also, in that sense, arise?
Yes, it's kind of saying that God's responsible for some things and not responsible for others.
If I could defer addressing that and go back to the bad bits, the problem that God designed things that cause some pain to people, it does not strike me that theistic evolution overcomes that problem, because a mother whose child has just died of malaria could, in my view, justifiably demand of God, why did you set up such a sloppy system to produce life that you knew there would be such predatory organisms? You knew there would be disease and so on. And if God is God, then apparently he could have designed some other system which would have produced life, but without all of these.
That's a philosophical question of theodicy. Could God have designed a better, different universe? Was there no other way of doing it than this way, so that conscious beings with the ability to relate to God would evolve over time, and that some of the downsides of evolution, and there are plenty of downsides in terms of pain and suffering, were a necessary consequence of that process. We have to explain it somehow. Different people come from different views on that.
We're going to have to draw things to a close, I'm afraid, gentlemen. It's been a fascinating time spent with you both. Thank you so much for joining me today. Michael, look forward to seeing you over here in November. We've got some really interesting things lined up for you, where there's a special invitation-only event, but we are going to be broadcasting it as a future show here on Unbelievable, so everyone will be able to hear it, but where you'll be interacting with Michael Rees. And that will be confusing because I'll have two Michaels to address. But Michael Rees, the former Director of Education for the Royal Society, who of course lost his job really in because of his essentially saying we should interact constructively with those who bring creationism and an idea into the classroom. But he's certainly, like Keith, very against intelligent design himself. He's a Christian ordained in the Church of England. That'll be a fascinating discussion. Look forward to having you for that. I'm sure lots of what we've spoken about today will be relevant there. In the meantime, if you want to book tickets to hear Michael, perhaps you've got friends who would be interested in hearing what he has to say, come along, make up your mind for yourself, and wherever you stand on this, I'm looking forward to a variety of questions being put to Michael after he's presented what he has to say. I understand you use quite a lot of graphics as well in this presentation, Michael, is that correct?
Yeah, I like to make it entertaining as well, so I have a lot of illustrations and these molecular machines, it's a lot easier to show you a picture of them than to describe them.
Yeah, well, that's the disadvantage of radio in a way. So we look forward to that. And again, you can book in for that at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. And there's also another link to it, which is premier.org.uk/Behe. But both of those, you'll be able to find the link there and book in for the event coming up on Monday, the 22nd of November. And you can only get to it if you register in advance. So I do urge you to do that. Don't leave it too late. Thank you in the meantime, gentlemen, for joining me on the programme today.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll have you both back on at some point in the future. And don't forget that you can listen back to this programme, as I say, the same web address for listening back to the programme. And we'll be hearing some of your responses to previous programmes in a short moment time, and hearing about what's coming up in future programmes as well, here on the show that gets you thinking unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Well, that really was a fascinating interaction between Michael and Keith. Let me say, just before he left, Keith wanted to let me know that Christians in Science, which he's the chairman of, is having its national conference in a week's time, Saturday the 30th of October. If you want to get along to that, it's at St Paul's Church, Robert Adams Street in London. £20 for Christian in Science members, £25 for non-members, only £10 for students. People like Professor Peter Harrison from Oxford, Professor John Henley Brooke, Professor David Livingstone, Dr Alan Chapman and Dr Dennis Alexander will all be present there. Find out more at cis.org.uk. That's next weekend, Saturday the 30th of October in London. Okay, let me tell you, there's been a lot of response to last week's show, The Moral Argument for God. Can I just apologise, first of all, because listening back, I kind of realised just how technical and philosophical that argument got, and I tried to, where possible, keep things at a level where hopefully a wide number of people can join in, but we got in pretty deep last week. So if you got lost, and even I was getting lost occasionally, my apologies. Let's look at some of your reaction to last week. This is David. He says, "What is virtue? I was listening to your debate regarding God and morality, and I must say I was not satisfied with either of your philosophers' defence for or against. In particular, the Christian philosopher. He, of course, let me remind you, was Glenn Peoples, a New Zealand philosopher, and he was in conversation with Arif Ahmed, Cambridge atheist philosopher. So you say, I was not particularly impressed with him. I'm surprised that he couldn't convince this man that there were moral absolutes. Moreover, his methodology was very weak. If we want to defend morality with regards to its origin, that is, coming from God, we have to do three things in order to establish it. First, we must define the nature of morality. We must first prove it exists, and we have not done so, then we can't prove its source. We can only induce or deduce this. What? Whether morality comes from God or not. To deduce or induce, we're starting from the end of something by examining it, then we systematically and methodically proceed backwards. For example, a detective enters a crime scene to investigate the reason and the hows of a murder. But notice, he's starting from the end and not the beginning, since he did not see the murder being committed. However, just because you don't see something doesn't mean you can't establish the truth. In fact, the very opposite is true. So by methodology and established methods of detective work, he can work backwards to establish what happened in the beginning, even without being present at the crime scene. And David goes on at some length about this. But essentially, you apparently feel that he could have done a better job at establishing that there are moral facts to begin with. Well, I think he did to some extent, but in a sense, to me, moral facts are something you intuit more than can kind of actually sort of scientifically or deductively prove necessarily. I think most people act and live and would acknowledge moral values. It's only when an atheist is forced to ask, well, where are they from? How do they exist in these kind of immaterial, objective concepts in a material world, that we run into problems. And Arif, being a consistent atheist last week, said, actually, yeah, I don't believe in absolute moral facts. Michael in Portland, Oregon in the USA says, a comment from the last show about moral facts. As an atheist, one frustration I have is that moral facts would on the face of it be directly contradicted by God's actions in the Bible. Your Christian guest said that looking into his child's eyes, he knows that to do bad things to his children is morally wrong. Didn't the Egyptian parents watching their children die of the plague feel the same way? How about Noah's neighbours watching their children struggle to keep their heads above water, gasping then succumbing? How can the moral lawgiver be responsible for actions that must be considered immoral? The only answer seems to be to duck the question, God is mysterious, etc. But that's not satisfying, given that the argument is that moral laws are absolute, given to us by a supremely moral being. How can there be an argument that says moral laws are absolute, but God is somehow exempt from moral analysis, and at the same time God is the moral lawgiver? And you finish your email saying, there is no simple answer to morality, no morality written in the stars, just lots of struggle, conversation, debate and reflection. Appreciate where you're coming from, but at the end of the day, we weren't doing a programme, Michael, on kind of biblical justification for the actions of God found in the Old Testament. I mean, that would be an interesting subject, and to ask, what was God doing and how can we justify that with the concept of a loving, all-good God. But I still don't think that then sort of in any way kind of contradicts the actual argument from morality, because that isn't an argument that actually brings in the Bible in that sense. It is a purely philosophical argument, and I think you have to treat it on its own terms. Then if you want to turn to, well, how does God then look like when we look at Scripture? How do we reconcile this all-loving God, all-good God with the actions we see in Scripture? Then that's a separate programme. I'm sure we'll do, but I think it's a separate issue. Nonetheless, thank you for your email. Graham, trying to whiz through these, says, I understand, Justin, that you find the moral argument for God one of the most compelling. I agree with you that it has a lot of appeal for people who intuitively feel that right and wrong really do exist, and this does support a case for God if the only answer from a sound atheist position is relativism or nihilism. You're also right to take to task those atheists who concoct morality by sneaking intrinsic values or absolute moral facts in through the back door. You may have come across desire utilitarianism or desirism that was developed by Alonzo Fife. If not, I think you'd find it interesting, as it proposes a theory that can be applied to every value-laden concept, from illness and injury to usefulness to beauty and ugliness, moral concepts such as duty and right. In particular, it does so whilst holding a strictly naturalistic line and rejects absolute moral facts and intrinsic values. And you go on to say that you feel that this is quite a fruitful line, a kind of moral system for atheists. You say, I do hold as an atheist to a consistently naturalistic worldview, and as a consequence, I am required to reject absolute moral facts and intrinsic values. I have no illusion that the universe owes me anything, let alone ultimate meaning and purpose. You say, I'm still investigating desirism, but it does look like a pretty solid and wholly naturalistic system of ethics. Now, fair enough, Graham, if that works for you, if that's a good ethical system on which to base your life, no problem. I suppose my ultimate thing, and I haven't looked at desirism to be fair, but if I did, and essentially what I found was a moral framework, the question would still arise for me, well, why should I adhere to this moral framework? There's an oughtness to morality that I don't think we can get past, a kind of, why should we do the things that you say, most benefit or, most give, create the flourishing of humans, or whatever terminology you want to use for it. Anyway, thanks for all those who've been getting in touch on this. Thanks also to Sebastian Melmoth, who's an interesting emailer. Says, philosophy programme, boring. But he does elaborate. He says, maybe boring because I've heard it all before, or maybe your guests represented the B team of debaters. For first-class debaters, I recommend Keith Ward and Anthony Grayling, AC Grayling. Tried to get him on a few times, but never quite snared AC Grayling. Perhaps another time. But anyway, you say book them ASAP. Apparently, you studied under AC Grayling. I think you are actually a Christian, Sebastian, but you say that he was an excellent teacher and highly educated in his speech. He's currently in the media a lot espousing atheism, although at the time I can't recall him mentioning God much, so this current bee in his bonnet appears to be a developing interest. Anyway, I hope there was something at least in the show that you appreciated. Here's someone who may be familiar if you're a regular listener to Premier, Cy Ten Bruggenkate, who came on back in the summer to talk about presuppositional apologetics. He is a presuppositionalist and created a whole bevy of various threads on the Unbelievable page of the Premier Community talking about presuppositional apologetics. So I listened to that programme on the moral argument, which in a sense has a very, presuppositionalist kind of aspect to it. He says, when I said on the programme that I did with Paul Baird back in the summer that your show has flashes of the presuppositional argument, I wasn't talking about those times when the moral argument was discussed. As you can see from the interaction with Glenn Peoples and Arif Ahmed, the brief instance where you introduced presuppositionalism, I'm glad you spotted that, Si, it was quickly pushed aside. I hope that you can see that without engaging Arif's presuppositions as to why we should be logical, we have lost the foundation from which to question the moral imperative as well, and that argument is gutted. Just for interest's sake, the times in your programme that I was referring to when presuppositionalism has surfaced in the past is those times when biblical authority was raised. In the programme where the efficacy of prayer was discussed, you brought up the verse from Luke 4 where we're commanded to not put the Lord our God to the test. Surely we can't expect God to endorse tests done on a sinful basis. Sadly, in that programme, as in this one, the presuppositional argument was just as quickly put aside. Unbelievers are without excuse. I really think that we should be demonstrating this to them. Cheers, Si. I understand what you're saying, Si, but I don't know. Does every apologetic argument ultimately boil down into a presuppositional argument? I don't know. Frankly, on one level, it just wouldn't be a very interesting show if that's the only argument you ever did. But I appreciate it. You feel it's the most powerful. I'm sure we will get back to it at some point because it produced so many interesting consequences when we did that. Anyway, afraid we're out of time for any more of your emails, so I'll have to hold off the others that came in on the moral argument. Until next time, thank you for listening today, and let me urge you again, if you haven't already, do log on to book into this event, Michael Behe, in London on Monday the 22nd of November in the evening. So if you want to find out more details, premier.org.uk/Behe, or the webpage, you can find a link through to the booking page there as well for this show. That's premier.org.uk/unbelievable. If you want to do it by phone, you can phone up and register yourself. 08456 52 52 52. I look forward to meeting you there. I'll be hobnobbing among the people who turn up, so it'd be lovely to meet you there. And of course, you'll get the chance to put your questions and comments to Michael Behe, who we heard on the programme today as well. That's Monday the 22nd of November at Westminster Chapel in London. So book in at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. For the moment, thank you for listening to today's programme. I look forward to seeing you next week. We're doing C.S. Lewis.
You're unbelievable.
In particular, looking at his apologetics arguments. He is one of the most famous Christian apologists of all time, I think. And his book, Mere Christianity, has helped a lot of people in their faith. But what about the arguments contained in it, the famous trilemma? Jesus was either Lord, lunatic, or liar. And other things, like the argument from morality, which was one of his favourites as well. We'll be looking at it with the help of C.S. Lewis expert Michael Ward. He's a Christian. Our atheist on the show will be Dan Barker, atheist from the States. Do hope you can join me at the same time next week here on the show that gets you thinking.